We listen for what the Spirit is saying to the church today as we pray for illumination. We ask that you will transform our minds, O wise Creator God, so that we might better perceive what is good and true. Give us wise judgment, so that we might choose to do that which builds others up. Grow in us a spirit of community, so that we might strive and work for wholeness in our world. Amen. Listen for the good news for today. A reading from the book of Exodus. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed upon them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. While her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, "Because I drew him out of the water," she said. A reading from the first letter from Peter. Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, "See, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame." To you then who believe, he is precious, but for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the very head of the corner, and a stone that makes them stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the word, as they were destined to do. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. In sacred words of old, we have heard the Spirit speak in you.
Talking of wonders, it must have been truly a wonder when George Brandis, of all people, got a standing ovation in the Senate. And it didn't come from his own side. I mean, poor old George must have got the surprise of his life when the Labor and the Green senators rose and applauded. I would imagine that we have all seen pictures of Pauline Hanson coming into the Senate chamber in a full-faced burqa. And she demanded of the Attorney General, when was he going to ban the garb that I suspect most Australians are more than a tad uneasy about? When was he going to follow the French example? But of course there was much more to it than just that theatre in the Senate that day. We all have to face the unpleasant fact that there are enough Australians today who are so spooked by the rapid growth of Islam in Australia and across the Western world that they are convinced that they represent a threat to our way of life. And they would dearly love to find some way of bringing them under control. And of course, better still, if only they would just go away. Now, I feel sure that most, if not all of us here this morning, would believe that Muslims have the right to practice their faith just as you and I are this morning. And I suspect that most of us would have joined in that standing ovation. Mrs. Hanson, and by dint of rather weird circumstance, I got to know her fairly well in our days in Queensland. She was our local member, and would you believe I ended up being her chaplain? Nobody told her, and I certainly didn't. Mrs. Hanson represents those who are afraid. And it is precisely the same set of circumstances, the same sort of fear that the Egyptians had of the rapidly growing Hebrews. And to begin with, you remember how Joseph's family turned up unexpectedly. They were starving and they were looking to buy food. And they were treated very generously by the Egyptians. And of course, it was mainly because of the fact that Joseph, again, through extraordinary circumstances, had risen to become the most powerful man in the land. And Joseph gave his family some of the most fertile land in Egypt. And under such magnanimous circumstances, the people grew, they multiplied, the birth rates rocketed, and their hard work made them wealthier than most Egyptians. And when they arrived, they simply wanted to buy wheat because they were starving. And they were simply known as Jacob's family, as Joseph's brothers and sisters. But now the circumstances had changed dramatically. Now they had become a conspicuous people, a strong community. They were virile, they were wealthy, and because of their increase in numbers, they were increasingly influential. And for those who were steeped in the way of thinking in those days, it became obvious what God was doing. He was fulfilling his promise to Abraham, and he was doing it big time. I mean, this is no less than the story of Israel being constituted and formed as God's own people. They started off as Abraham's family. Now look at them. Once you were not a people, said 1 Peter, but now you are a people. And the new Pharaoh and all of the Egyptians were afraid, and they acted out of that fear. You might almost wonder, where was George Brandis when he was needed? If ever anyone needed to hear his speech, the new Pharaoh needed to hear. Now, we must remember that this story is not just an interesting folk tale. This story is in fact theology. And when the new Pharaoh takes this gruesome action to subdue the Hebrew community, little does he know that in fact he's taking on God. And as you look back on the adventures of that family, all through the time ever since God had made that promise to Abraham, all through the family's struggles, we see God making sure that his promise is not going to be compromised. And so when Pharaoh suddenly enslaves them and sets out to make them build 2 new towns, which they did, they not only survive, but to Pharaoh's utter amazement, their birth rate actually goes up. That is, God's blessing is even, if anything, more richly with them. And so the befuddled Pharaoh escalates his campaign as he commands all Hebrew babies to be drowned in the Nile. But again, the midwives this time, it's they who outwit Pharaoh, and most of the boys live. Most importantly, the baby who was to grow into the great leader Moses lived. He was saved, and he was nurtured right under Pharaoh's nose. God ensures that his intention for these people is going to be protected. Whatever happens, they are going to be his people. And meanwhile, if you put yourself in the Hebrews' position, They must have wondered what in the world was going on as they're subject to this terrible trauma. I mean, one moment they were welcome guests who had really made good in Egypt, and the next moment they were feared slaves who were put down and cruelly treated. Well, I wonder whether that sort of sudden transition rings a bell to us. I mean, the church was an almost universally respected cornerstone of society not all that long ago, when you and I were children growing up. Almost 80% of Australians went to church, and the church was respected. How things have changed within the space of little more than a generation or two, as we have become gently marginalised. The church these days is often suspect, and it's certainly considered an anachronism. A chosen race, the king's priests, a holy nation, God's own people, chosen to proclaim the wonderful acts of God. Years before, was it 1,000 years before? We don't really know. But years before, the enslaved Hebrews would have thought it would be a cruel joke if you applied those descriptions to them. What about the church today? When you look at us, chosen, priests, a holy nation, are they descriptions that you would immediately relate to personally? I mean, it seems that there have just been too many catastrophes in our recent church pilgrimage, such as the terrible plague of sexual abuse by clergy. There are too many horrible experiences, such as the closing of one church after another. And all of those things makes the whole idea of having been chosen by God to be his holy people appear to be tragically absurd. Thomas Dozeman, who's an American Old Testament scholar, says that the story of Pharaoh and the scary Hebrews is all about power struggles. He says, we've seen Jacob. He was a rogue. Jacob abused the power that God had given him. You wonder why? Why did God put up with Jacob? And God even gives Jacob the exalted name of Israel, which became the name not just of God's people, but of the nation. And alongside Jacob, we've got God, who uses his power to stick to his promise in spite of the terrible human behaviour that he has to put up with. And meanwhile, we look at the story and we see Pharaoh representing the pinnacle of human power. I mean, Pharaoh is the leader of the great superpower of the time. And he controls the fate of nations and whole groups of people. And then there's the midwives. And the contrast between the midwives and Pharaoh is almost absurd. These midwives have been directed to throw all human baby boys into the Nile. They're the ones who must enact the genocide. But they've virtually got no power in their own right. But we're told that they fear God. And those midwives turn out to represent the power of God's promise. And then the surprising twist comes that these seemingly powerless midwives are the one who in fact create dread in Pharaoh. And if these humble women find ways to frustrate Pharaoh's orders, or the pinnacle of human power, then Pharaoh with all of his huge armies is rendered powerless just by these few midwives. What emerges then is that despite the terrible things that God's people must endure, and they endure the slavery, the attempted genocide, it turns out that it's not Pharaoh who has the power. When you look back at some of the things that had happened before they arrived in Egypt, you remember how those brothers had argued amongst themselves and ended up throwing Joseph down the pit. They had the power to do what they liked with Joseph. But it turns out that it's not the warring family that has the power. And as we go into future chapters of the book of Exodus, we find out how Pharaoh ultimately does let his people go. And they survived all of those years in the wilderness, and finally they enter the promised land. So what we've got here in our Old Testament reading this morning is the story of how God's promise cannot be stopped by any despotic military might. It can't be stopped by the petulant behaviour of people who get all sorts of funny ideas in their heads. Not even the way that God's people misuse the power that God gives them can frustrate that promise. And then when we move into the Gospels and we hear Peter, at last, Jesus has been waiting for the disciples to catch on to what his messiahship is all about. And at last, Peter comes out with his confession of faith at Caesarea Philippi. And you can just imagine the relief with Jesus as he said, "How blessed are you, Peter. You have become the man of faith, and this faith is the rock on which I will build my church. And not even the gates of Hades will be able to overcome it." This is faith that brings the authority of God's promise. And the people of faith are the rock against which nothing will prevail. And so the character of a uniformed or unified people of God was forged, and it persevered against all odds. When you look at the history of the church, you can see how it's littered with disasters and pain and disobedience and perversion. And the miracle is that despite all of that, for millennia, God's promise has remained rock solid. I mean, I often wonder how in the world it was that the gospel survived the Dark Ages. When you read some of the things that went on in the church in that almost 1,000 years, it was full of corruption, degradation, and yet somehow there was a spark that remained alive, and that spark was ready for the Reformation. The gates of hell did not prevail. So it's 2017. And the church has this totally undeserved awareness of our own identity as a chosen and a holy people. we're able to look back and reflect that through all of the ups and downs of the church, even through the massive misbehaviour of God's people, that God has stuck to his promise. Those enslaved Hebrews had no idea what the future held. And they must have thought that once Pharaoh declared war on them, as he virtually did, they must have thought that was the end. The medieval church could have had no inkling of what was coming. And today, none of us has any idea where God is taking his church today. But we do know that God made a promise to Abraham that he has never allowed to waver. And that promise was reaffirmed by Jesus of Nazareth when he responded to the faith of Peter. And so here we are in 2017. People of faith, you and I, are the rock on which God has founded his church. And as we look to the future, there is this amazing assurance that there is no power, temporal or otherwise, that will prevail against his people. Amen.